All right, welcome everybody to the Real Crusades History Podcast. We're already to our fifth episode in this First Crusade podcast series. It almost feels like just yesterday we started with number one. So here we are. We're going to be talking today about the Fall of Antioch and the epic Battle of Antioch against Kerbogha. We are still in the year 1098, and we just finished talking about the rather lengthy siege of Antioch, and we are going to start off with this point of Bohemond's ruse. Is he going to be able to pull it off? We're going to find out tonight. So, my name is Stephen Roberts, and I'm also joined by Scott Amos. Scott, welcome aboard.
Always glad to be here, Stephen.
Always glad to have you. And we've also got Rand. Welcome, Rand.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. Great to have you, Rand. And we're very pleased to welcome back our academic guest, Dr. William Hamblin. Dr. Hamblin, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So we're getting into this kind of critical moment in the Siege of Antioch. So last time, guys, we were talking about, the Crusaders had been outside of Antioch for months and months. I mean, the siege began back in 1097 in October, and we're getting into the summertime, May and into June. So I mean, it just gives you an idea of how long this had been going on. There had been a couple of battles. The Crusaders had defeated a couple of attempts to reinforce Antioch from Aleppo and Damascus, and we actually just heard too about how Tatikios, the Byzantine representative who was there with a small Byzantine contingent, has pulled out at this point. And we also have talked about how the fact that Stephen of Blois, the Count of Blois and Chartres, he also is going to leave on June 2nd. He apparently felt that things were so difficult that he wasn't going to attempt to be involved any longer in this siege. And desertions in general had been a problem throughout this long siege, but this was one of the major leaders leaving, one who wasn't particularly active or particularly noteworthy for his leadership skills, I suppose. But Stephen of Blois pulls out on June 2nd and leaves with his troops. And interestingly,
something his fiery wife will never let him live down.
Yeah, unfortunately for him, he was married to a Norman. Yeah.
Yeah, I would want to have been in his shoes after reading about it.
Yeah, Adela of Normandy. She was pretty rough.
Sounds like it.
I was recently reading about her. She was kind of involved in her brother King Henry I's intrigues and some of his stuff that was going on back in England, but not to divert from what we're talking about though. But yeah, so June 2nd, the day that Stephen of Blois leaves, is also going to be the night that Bohemond is going to spring his trap. As we talked about last time, Bohemond had been in communication with a rogue Armenian who was kind of going to basically be acting as a double agent, a Muslim Armenian named Firuz, who was in control of one of the towers of Antioch. He was the captain of one of those towers. Bohemond had turned him into a double agent, and this guy Firuz was intending to surrender this tower to Bohemond at the appropriate time. So we talked a little bit last time too about the fact that there had been this major meeting among the leaders, the leading noblemen of the Crusaders, and they had basically agreed that if Bohemond could get them into Antioch, they were going to let him have it. Not everybody agreed to this, but a lot of people were okay with this because they felt that Bohemond was going to be their best bet to get inside of Antioch based on his previous performance in a variety of areas in this crusade. So let's talk about Bohemond's trap and kind of how his plot unfolded. I'm going to turn to our academic guest here, Dr. Hamblin. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Like, what happens on the night of June 3rd?
Well, it's in part it's a very secret plan, and in part it probably the other commanders knew what's going on. They had agreed that if Bohemond could take the city, that he could more or less inherit the city and become the ruler. And his plan was what you might call a special forces operation. He first of all sent off some troops on a fake foraging expedition, kind of just the Turks in the city and up on the citadel could watch the Crusader movements, and they saw a big column of troops leaving. And that the purpose of this was first to kind of lower their care and observation, and secondly, if a portion of the army's gone, they shouldn't be expecting an assault. So this group went off and then circled around, and at night came back in the to the south under cover of darkness. And Ferouz seems to have had a tower on the south wall, probably partway up the mountain towards the citadel. That wall would have been less guarded than the walls down in the valley, because most of the Crusader troops were in the valley. So Ferouz is in charge of this wall. There's probably only just a few guards there, and their purpose is to observe and then summon help if there's a problem. And Ferouz lets down a rope. They tie a kind of a rope ladder to it, and it is pulled up, secured on the top of the wall, and then the Crusaders start going up one by one. Now, one of the men that was there is the author of the anonymous Gesta from Coram. We don't know his name, but he was apparently actually present. And it's kind of rare that you get a operation like that where an eyewitness, not only an eyewitness, but a participant explains the information. So their first goal, get in the tower. Now notice they're not getting in a gate, because the gates have many more men by them, and it's very difficult to bribe 100 guards at a gate versus a few at a tower. Anyway, they get up the tower. They have some problems because their rope kind of collapses and they start to panic, but they get a second ladder up there. They get onto the tower, and once they do, they sound a trumpet. Now, this is probably at about dawn. They would have done the operation, when it was dark, but just getting enough light. They wanted to be up there so that the actual battle would have some light in it, because night operations in medieval times were very difficult. So they get to the top, they sound these trumpets, and that was the signal for the other armies to start attacking. And part of the reason the other Crusader armies started attacking was to draw off the Turks away from the Crusader getting into the city, to draw the armies off, because now the Turks are becoming confused. Are they in the city? Where are they in the city? Where are they attacking? And so on. And the second goal then of Bohemond's group is to open a gate. Because if you can get a gate open, with the men they had in the tower, there weren't enough to take the city. You had a few dozen. If you can get a gate open, then the whole army can start moving in, and the whole balance of power shifts dramatically. So that's their next goal, is to open the gates. And as they do, the Turks start to panic. And the panic is not just that there are Crusaders in the town. The panic is they don't know what's going on. There's no way for them to have accurate information of which gate has fallen, what tower did they take. So most of the Turks are running around in utter confusion, and in that situation, they panic and they start to scatter, and that, of course, simply furthers the success of this secret invasion and kind of special forces operation that Bohemond and his kind of elite Normans did. I'll let somebody else pick up the story from there if you want, or I can keep going. It's up to you.
Well, I want to just kind of see if I can imagine this situation here. So would they have actually sounded the alert trumpet before they got a gate open? Because
It's not clear to me which they did. The
Seems
problem
like you
is
want to get that gate open first.
that very well may be the case, but the problem is to get which gate they got to and how they could get it open in time. I mean, it's just not clear to me. So it very well may have been though that they got a gate open and sounded the trumpet. So you know, it occurred in the opposite direction.
So it's not
to use it. It's that's very common in modern military operations. No plan survives first contact, and that's kind of what always reminded me of this initial entry into Antioch. It really was probably just a lot of chaos on both sides. You know, it was and it's just the Crusaders were a little bit more effective at controlling that chaos than the Antioch garrison was.
And the Crusaders knew what they were doing, that at least they had a general plan, whereas the Turks had no idea what was going on.
And which gate was the first to be opened?
I'm not sure.
It's not recorded.
It may be recorded, but if it is, I can't remember. So
logically, I mean, logically, looking at the map of Antioch at that time and where Bohemond's attack was supposed to have been conducted. By the way, I'm getting my information from John Victory in the East.
Right.
But the closest gate to where he's thought to have led his raid is the St. George Gate.
Right. But there's a problem with that in that it's on the other side of the Orontes from all the other access points.
Yeah.
So how that would have worked, I don't know.
Yeah.
There's the problem with crusading sources is there's a lot more that they don't tell us than that they tell us, and so we're always left with questions. But that would be my guess is St. George Gate, but I'm not certain on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is just a really powerful moment in the First Crusade. Kind of how this really important siege was decided, on just this one little tower on Antioch, and basically a flimsy rope ladder is what made this whole thing possible. So, Bohemond himself was one of the first to climb up that ladder. In fact. So yeah, it's a pretty amazing story. You've got this small number of Normans who are going to be climbing up this ladder and getting control of this tower, and yeah, I think the element of surprise is the big thing here. I mean, the chaos that this is going to create once, especially once they can get a gate open and they can start getting the other troops in the city. I mean, you can see how the situation is just going to get out of control for the Turkish garrison very quickly. And on top of that, I know that there were quite a few Christians already within Antioch. And I'm not a big fan of Stephen Runciman, but I do remember him talking about how a lot of the local Armenians and Greeks within Antioch kind of joined the Crusaders in attacking the local Turks, or attacking the Turkish garrison. And so this was a very difficult situation for Yaghi-Siyan's garrison to keep control of, and Yaghi-Siyan himself is going to pretty much flee almost immediately. And of course, that's always a devastating thing when you've got the person who's in overall command just pulling out. He tries to escape. He's actually captured by an Armenian, apparently. He falls from his horse and he's left for dead by his companions, and one of the local Armenians cuts his head off and takes it to Bohemond. Most likely, kind of once a lot of this stuff is dying down. But yeah, there's a very violent sack of the city. Antioch is put to the sack. So, does anybody else have any comments about this particular point in the siege or in the fall of Antioch, or do we want to move on?
Yeah, I've read that there was a lot of indiscriminate killing. That in the dark, the Crusaders couldn't see who they were killing, and a lot of Christians were killed. I mean, I don't know. What truth is there to that?
I think it's pretty certain that happened. The Crusader sources.
Scale, I guess, is what I'm.
Well, the Crusader sources say it happens. That is,
Yeah.
It's not the Muslims blaming the Crusaders, and they're somewhat apologetic for that. But the fundamental problem is they don't have enough cultural nuance in their understanding of Middle Eastern culture to distinguish a Greek, an Armenian, or a Syriac, or a Jew, or a Muslim solely on the basis of physical appearance or dress. And so part of it is simply confusion on their part. That they kill a person and they think it's a Muslim, but they don't know that it's really a Greek or an Armenian or someone. So that's I think it's fundamentally a function of confusion and uncertainty and on the Crusader part, and they're going to err on the side of killing a person who's a potential enemy, as opposed to asking, are you a Muslim or are you a Christian, that type of thing.
But scale wise, the Christians who took the Crusaders side, I guess
we have to remember too that
those who were killed.
Ibn al-Athir tells us that Yaghi-Siyan threw a lot of the Christians out of Antioch. So there probably were a lot of Eastern Christians in the Crusader camp when this was going on. And again, there would have been Eastern Christians, with the Crusaders when they were running around Antioch, taking control of things. So I do think we have to be careful about. I'm sure, there's always friendly fire, I guess, if you will, in warfare. That does happen at times, but to what extent that was going on, I mean, I don't think we can assume that there was just like mass slaughter of the Christian population of Antioch.
No, it was mostly a function of, and what you're seeing in the Chronicles is, yes, the many of the men who wrote the Chronicles and the histories accompanied the army, but a lot of these guys weren't military men by profession. So they're kind of, maybe they saw some isolated incidents and were maybe shocked and or put off by it and sort of, that's what stuck in their mind when they wrote their accounts of it. Whereas somebody with a little more military experience could have looked at that and been like, oh no, that was just confusion. That was fog of war. That was, hey, you didn't know who these people were. They rushed out at us with weapons. They looked like, they looked like Muslims. It was probably something that was a lot more explainable, as opposed to just, oh yeah, we just came in here and like massacred everybody, because those same chronicles then, and ones that come just after talk about, there being a very healthy native Christian presence in Antioch, even just shortly after that. So, they obviously didn't wipe everyone out, or not even close to everyone. So it's always, you always have to read between the lines a little bit.
Well, there was an evil tendency toward hyperbole there too.
Yeah.
In these writings.
It's kind of difficult to imagine, I think, sometimes what the sacking of a city would have looked like. I mean, I think it certainly would have been a violent affair. There would have been, there's a lot of looting that goes on in that situation. Some of the upper nobility guys are going to be concerned with getting control of the strategic, portions of the city. Like we know Bohemond, for example, tried to get into the citadel immediately. He wasn't able to, so he took possession of portion of the walls by the citadel. Raymond of Toulouse takes control of the palace. But there's also going to be foot soldiers who are going to just run around and try to get some property. That just like sort of like looting and that sort of thing. So on the one hand, it's going to be an incredibly violent and chaotic affair. But I also think we want to be careful about being too extreme in the way we look at it. Like you're not going to. it's not going to be like just, I think in Hollywood, they often show it like people just running around swinging swords randomly, you know, kind of screaming at the top of, you know, I mean, it wasn't that either. I mean, you know, so.
we actually have a better grip on this from the sack of Constantinople in 1204, where we have more eyewitnesses, and you can get a sense of this. But most of the people in the city are going to be hiding. They're not going to be running around. They're going to hide. And so most of them will probably successfully hide because they know the town and the Crusaders don't know the town. Your problem is going to be if you are in a place where there is potential wealth to be had. And if you try to stop the Crusaders from stealing something that they, you know, whatever silk jacket or something, they might just beat you. But we do know the nature of sacks in general from things like where we have many more narrative sources from the 30 Years' War and Napoleonic Wars and things like that. And they could be very bloody affairs. It's kind of Crusaders gone wild stuff where they just, the commanders lose control of the army in some ways. And I think
absolutely
the best manifestation of this is that they failed to secure the citadel, and that's a strategically a disaster from their perspective, especially as soon as Kerbogha arrives. And if they had had control of their army, they probably could have secured the citadel. And the fact that they didn't means, I mean, Bohemond tries, but most of the soldiers are just not under orders at this time. They're not going to be obeying their commanders.
Right, and the leaders of the army aren't going to be concerning themselves with, you know, well, is that infantryman off running, you know, raping somebody or something like that? I mean, yeah, that's not going to be the. So there's going to be all kinds of like sort of low level violence, I guess, going on as the common soldiers kind of, you know, sort of have free reign at this point. But the main leaders are going to be concerning themselves with these strategic points in the city. So yeah, that's where we are now. You know, we have this violent sack of Antioch on the night of June 3rd, and by morning it's pretty much over. You know, the Turkish garrison has been slaughtered. What's left of the Turkish garrison has managed to occupy the citadel, as Dr. Hamlin was talking about. And of course, we also know that Kerbogha is on the way. And in fact, what's very interesting is that the next day, or 2 days later, June 5th, Kerbogha's troops begin arriving and they begin to surround Antioch. And so we kind of, I mean, in every single Crusades book, we get this phrase, the besiegers became the besieged. The Crusaders are now trapped inside of Antioch to an extent. You know, the walls are still very much intact because the city was taken by subterfuge, not by storm. So they can, you know, protect themselves inside of Antioch. But Kerbogha shows up. His army, it's very large, so it takes quite a while for the army to you know, be completely put in place. But the army is able to completely surround Antioch, and they're able to overrun some of the small fortresses nearby that the Crusaders had taken control of. And the Crusaders are pretty much pinned inside of Antioch at that point. And of course, Antioch has just endured a months-long siege. Food is now scarce in the city. Once again, the Crusaders are facing the threat of starvation. So, so yeah, that's where we are at this point. Does anybody want to talk about what's going on right now? Kerbogha is putting the city to siege. What is going to be the next move of the Crusaders?
Well, I think we should note that Kerbogha is the Crusaders. Basically, all the food in the city had been used up during the first siege, but all the food outside the city had also been used up in the first siege as well. And so when Kerbogha arrives, he is going to face a problem of logistically maintaining his army during the siege as well. Now, he's got an advantage because he can go to Aleppo and different Muslim cities and buy food and ship it in. His real problem is probably pasture for his horses because his army is largely cavalry. And so he's he's got a bunch of logistical pressures on him that are not as bad as the Crusaders, but they are serious enough to help kind of push his decision-making process one way or the other as the siege progresses.
And we also know that Kerbogha had an issue of the unity within his army. He had a lot of sort of lower level emirs underneath him, and so he had kind of this coalition force that was not particularly cohesive. A lot of these guys weren't particularly interested in dying for Kerbogha, if you will. So he had a very large army, but I guess the question was, how motivated was his army? I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Hamlin.
Well, it's just that the Syrian princes feared Kerbogha more than they feared the Crusaders, probably, in the sense that if he came in, they'd either become his vassals or he'd just take over their cities from them. The Crusaders, in some ways, would do the same thing, but they know the Crusaders are thinking about Jerusalem. And so, you know, they feel that Kerbogha is probably just the same type of threat, a different threat, but still they're if he wins, they'll be on his side. But the minute he starts to lose, their loyalty is going to become quite questionable.
Yeah, I think to piggyback on that, you know, a very important distinction to make between the Crusaders and Kerbogha is Kerbogha may have a very large and very impressive army, but there's a division are very run pretty deeply through it. Also, none of them are really desperate. The Crusaders are kind of in a Cortez moment right now. Like this is it. If they don't succeed here, and they've been in a couple of those already, but if they don't succeed here, they're done. And not only are they done, but they're probably all going to die. You know, except maybe a few lucky ones who are able to get away, but that's not guaranteed. So, you know, yes, while the Crusaders may have some divisions within themselves as well, desperation has a habit of turning rivals into allies very quickly, and I think they're all, you know, the Crusaders at this point were pretty united in, hey, if we don't get through this, we're all dead. So
yeah, and you know, they'd already been through quite a bit of difficult fighting over the course of this crusade. I know one thing that Christopher Tyerman points out in God's War is that as the first crusade went along, the fighting effectiveness of this army of Crusaders kind of increased because they become more experienced, they become better at working together. So yeah, there's kind of this gradual process of these guys kind of becoming really hardened, effective veterans in a certain respect. So
the other aspect of that is that their numbers decrease, but of those that survive, they're higher quality troops than were the original Crusaders who, you know, came down to Constantinople. And so troop quality increases, but also probably the amount of armor increases as well, because as a Crusader dies, somebody's going to take his armor and put it on. When they kill a Turk, they're going to take whatever armor he has. There's description of soldiers on the Crusader army carrying Turkish shields and things like this. So the quality increases, but so does the what you might call the heaviness of their equipment. There's a higher percentage of men with mail coats at Antioch than there would have been at Nicaea or Dorylaeum.
Another question: what was in it for the emirs who allied with Kerbogha?
You mean what were their personal goals?
Yeah, what would be in it for that? You know, this was
right. Basically, if say Dukac comes on the campaign and his army is there, if Kerbogha takes Antioch, Dukac is not going to get Antioch. He does not personally increase his domain in the slightest. he will probably get a share of the spoils, the slaves, treasure, whatever that might be. But he's not going to increase his political power. And relatively speaking, his political power will decrease because Kerbogha is going to rule Antioch directly now. And that's going to increase his authority, thereby making him more powerful proportionally than he had been before. So most of the ordinary soldiers are not motivated by jihad at this time because they're not starting to conceptualize the struggle with the Crusaders as a religious struggle at this point. For them at this point, it is a political military struggle. The Crusaders see it as a religious war. The Muslims not yet. They will quite soon, but at this point, these are just an enemy. Probably no different conceptually than the Byzantines. The average soldier is fighting for plunder. The rulers had what was called an askar, which is essentially a professional standing army, and they are the Lord's personal troops. They were very well paid, and some of them are going to get command positions if they've conquered Antioch and the surrounding area. Some of these emirs of Kerbogha's personal emirs, not the vassals, they would have then been placed in positions of power. So there'd be a wide range of motivation for the Crusader army, but a lot of them would feel threatened by a Kerbogha victory,
or for Kerbogha's army.
Right. Yeah.
Thanks for that explanation, Dr. Hamblin. So at this point, the Crusaders again are in a very desperate situation. Meanwhile, while this is going on, Stephen of Blois, who has fled, is going to encounter Alexios Kamnenis in Anatolia. And Alexios had apparently been on his way with an army to reinforce Antioch. And based on Stephen's reports, Stephen, of course, is very eager to justify his flight from Antioch. And so he's going to tell Alexios, it's all done. They've been defeated. Everybody's dead. Forget it. And Alexios says, well, okay. And he decides to turn his army around and head back to Constantinople. We kind of mentioned a little bit of that last time, but it sort of highlights the desperate situation that the Crusaders were in. They really were they didn't have any relief on the way, and they were pinned inside of Antioch. And I'm sure it was probably pretty difficult too, staffing the walls. I mean, Antioch is so enormous, and the fortifications are very considerable. And those walls have got to be guarded, obviously. Otherwise the same thing that happened to Yaghi-Siyan's garrison could happen to the Crusaders. So it must have been a high stress situation. Food is scarce. You're trying to maintain the defense of the city, and people are in a difficult situation here. So one thing that begins to manifest is this religious devotion that frequently has helped the Crusaders through difficult situations.
Before you go on to that, just one point about the tactical situation of the Crusaders, and that is the Turks hold the citadel, which is a self-contained castle that can be defended independent of the city. There is, however, no fortification barrier between the citadel and the lower city. And so that creates a real tactical problem. And the only thing that saves them, the Turks attack from the citadel into the city, but since it's up on a really kind of craggy, steep mountain slope, the citadel is, the attacks down into the city from that are quite difficult, and the Crusaders hold them off. And eventually they build some barricades around the citadel to stop, to try to control Turkish raids out of the citadel. But that simply compounds the problem. Even holding the citadel, they would have had a problem against Kerbogha. But without that, it's essentially like having an open gate in the city that you have to defend with a barricade.
And how many men were placed in the citadel?
We don't have any sources on that, but it was certainly a few thousand. would have
And also,
been up there.
Kerbogha was able to reinforce that citadel. Like,
Right.
it wasn't just the original guys who had fled to that citadel. Kerbogha was he's going to put all kinds of his own guys in there too.
It's not just that he kicks out Yaghi-Siyan's son and puts one of his own emirs in charge of the citadel. So he not only sends reinforcements, but he actually occupies it. And this is part of his kind of arrogance to the lower vassals, that instead of saying we're all in it together and we all get a share of the plunder, he just takes the citadel from Yaghi-Siyan's son, who had helped defend it for 6 weeks or whatever. And that type of attitude further antagonizes his vassals and emirs.
Yeah, that could have easily been a morale killer there. Just knowing that was how the defender or somebody who'd been involved in the defense of Antioch had been treated. So I guess we're going to move on now to what's going on inside of Antioch as the Crusaders are trying to defend the city. There is this guy named Peter Bartholomew who is, I think in some sources he's described as a religious of some sort. He's a poor Provençal who, basically one of these southern French individuals who would have been with the army of Raymond of Toulouse. And this guy, Peter Bartholomew, approaches Count Raymond with tales of these visions from St. Andrew. And he says that St. Andrew has told him that the Holy Lance, which that is a sacred relic in the Christian tradition, this lance that would have been used to pierce Christ while he was hanging from the cross at his death, St. Andrew has revealed to Peter Bartholomew, he says, that this relic can be found buried under the altar of the Cathedral of St. Peter. So this is one of the major churches in Antioch, a church named after St. Peter because, of course, Antioch is associated with St. Peter. He's the apostle who evangelized Antioch. And so the idea of finding a relic like this would have been a very meaningful thing to the Crusaders. So Raymond actually orders that an excavation be initiated inside of St. Peter's. So they're going to be digging underneath the altar. And in fact, Peter Bartholomew apparently is one of the individuals digging inside of this hole. There's a lot of people who are skeptical. There's a lot of people who believe in Peter's visions. But one day, Peter apparently jumps out of this hole and he has found, he says, the Holy Lance. He's got this iron shard. This is the Holy Lance. This is the relic of an item that actually touched Christ. This is a holy object. We can kind of talk a little bit about, I guess, how relics were viewed by medieval Christians. It's this idea that God kind of acts through the material world and sort of brings spiritual benefit about through these material signs. Kind of, similarly to how, this whole idea that Christ redeemed the world through the incarnation, through, becoming man. But so yeah, this relic is discovered, and there's a lot of people who are skeptical. In fact, I think it's interesting. Bishop Adamar is one of the more noteworthy skeptics. But for a lot of the common people in the army, this is a really marvelous sign. This is a sign from God that He has not abandoned them, that they are going to be able to come through this siege victorious. So it's a morale booster for the Crusaders. Does anybody want to talk about the Holy Lance at this point?
I just have one question here before we move on. At the time, what was the age of the structure, the church?
I'm sorry, what was that, Scott?
What was the age of the structure, the church?
Most of them did. Yeah, most of them dated back to the Constantinian era. So, kind of, between Saint Helena. I'm not sure if she was responsible for building that church. I don't think so, but it would have been from the later Roman period, probably early Byzantine.
It would have been 500 or 600 years old at at that time.
At most.
Yeah. It wasn't recently built. Okay.
No.
It would have been basically a Byzantine church is what we're talking about. So.
Yeah.
Already very old at the time.
Yeah. The patriarch of the Syriac Church claimed Petrine authority from St. Peter, who founded the church in Antioch according to the New Testament. So it's very important it had a Rome-like sense to the Syriac Christians that probably the Crusaders didn't quite conceptualize. So it was a very important center for Middle Eastern Syriac Christians. I think it's worth noting that basically the idea of a relic is that a person who is imbued with the Holy Spirit, and especially Christ, who is God Himself or the Son of God, when they touch things, they transfer holiness, which is not an abstract, but it is a very real thing. It's kind of like being radioactive. And so if you're radioactive and you touch something, it becomes radioactive, and that power is never diffused. It remains in the relic, which could be the bones of a person, the hair, could be the clothing they wore, a tooth, it can be anything. And the supreme relics are the relics of Christ's crucifixion, because they're associated with Christ directly as opposed to St. Peter or someone else indirectly. And they also are associated with his blood, which from the medieval Catholic conceptualization of the Mass and the blood of Christ's blood on these that touched these relics was especially holy. And so the nails of the crucifixion, the cross itself, the true cross is going to become the supreme relic of the Crusaders. The crown of thorns, which eventually ends up in the hands of St. Louis, he builds an entire church just to house the crown of thorns. And then the lance that pierced Christ's side, which is this true lance, or the lance that Peter is supposed to have found, that again would have the blood on it. And likewise, the chalice or the Holy Grail mythology is associated with Christ's blood as it develops, maybe beginning in this time, but probably a little bit later on. And so if this really is the lance, and there's doubt among the Crusaders about that, but if it really is the lance, then it is a supremely important, one of the top half a dozen or dozen relics in the world because of its direct association with Christ and his blood and the crucifixion.
Yeah, this is still very much a concept that we have in the Catholic Church, this idea that, God uses the physical world or these physical objects as kind of it's a vehicle in some sense for
Conduits.
Right. It's a conduit. It's this is this would have been a very powerful sign from God. This was something that would have been very like Dr. Hamlin's pointing out. This would have been incredibly important to the crusading army. This is and it's going to be a totem at the Battle of Antioch. This is something they're going to actually carry into battle with them. So yeah, the Holy Lance would have been an incredibly important relic. But does anybody else have any other comments about the Holy Lance?
Well, now another Holy Lance existed in Constantinople.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that was the, I know Adhemar of Lepuy was quite doubtful of the authenticity of the...
He probably would have been shown that lance because of his, the supreme status as the legate of the Pope. The patriarch or whoever would have taken him around and said, here's our most holy relic. So he'd probably seen it personally in Constantinople, which might explain part of his skepticism.
Actually, from many of the sources, you get that not only Adamar, but actually, I would say a decent majority of the the more higher ranking clergy that accompanied the crusade were rather skeptical of it. In fact, you had some like the Norman bishop who would eventually become the first patriarch, the first Latin patriarch of Jerusalem, who accompanied Robert of Normandy. I can't remember his name. He openly expressed disbelief at it, and was made no attempt to hide his skepticism about it. So it's a very interesting case study in the the more educated compared to the more popular commoner and stuff like that, and
yeah, it's important to note that often people say, well, medieval Christians were just completely gullible on everything, but they really weren't. They had a lot of skepticism. A lot of times their skepticism was based on different things than modern skepticism, but which is essentially materialistic. So Adamar believed in the spiritual reality of relics. He just didn't necessarily believe that this one was real, was authentic. So
right.
Well,
Yeah.
I've often, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that this was something that would have been maybe for the common soldier. This would have been kind of particularly potent to them, just because they are going to be maybe in the most difficult situation in some respects, because they don't have the means of some of the upper nobility, and so kind of this sort of sign is going to be powerful for somebody who just is an ordinary soldier who is terrified for his life, has no idea what's coming. So I was just going to say that. But what were you going to say, Scott?
Well, I was just going to say the physical realities of where the lance was discovered, how deep was it buried, how long it took them to finally find it. It just makes me wonder about the whole. I mean, which one was really authentic? I mean, did Peter actually have a vision? Was he talking about the real thing? Apparently, it took quite a while to find it, and
they dug
up the whole floor of the floor would have been paved with stone, and then there would have been some kind of rubble underlayment under that, and I mean, it was a physically quite a job to do it, and apparently took a good part of a day to find it.
Right. I mean, it's the ultra skeptic would say that Bartholomew had it on him and planted it,
right?
And planted
yeah, but
that's
from the accounts I've read of it, of how it was discovered, that sounds like it would have been a pretty impossible thing to do.
Well, Raymond of the historian Raymond, who was with
Count Raymond,
and he participated in the dig. I mean, he was in there digging. He claims to have been the first person to have seen it, and that it was just the tip, the point was kind of sticking out of the ground. And when he sees it, he kneels down and kisses it. I mean, there's no reason to think that he's not telling the truth about that. So they clearly found something, and piece of iron. And I think some of the issue was also that it was a fragment, that it wasn't. These relics can be fragmented, right? You can take a finger of a saint, or maybe just the one part of the finger bone, and the holiness is still 100% in whatever. So if this was just a bit of fragment off the true lance, the lance in Constantinople could be authentic, and this could just be a piece of it, just like they would take pieces of the true cross and give them to kings and churches and stuff. They kind of, I've seen several of these which are just little teeny slivers like a toothpick off the true cross. So from their perspective, the fact that there's one in Constantinople didn't necessarily negate the other one, because it seems to have just been a piece of iron rather than an actual, no recognizable lance head.
One aspect of this story that I've always found interesting is that contrary to so many other events, similar events that occur during the First Crusade, there's almost no mention of any input or commentary by the native Christians in the city. There's no, there's no indication, at least from any of the chronicles, that people asked, was there a tradition of a Holy Lance fragment being in that cathedral? Because many of the native Christians did a very good job at, even despite centuries of Islamic rule, did a very good job of preserving places that they knew of, that they knew about, and they just carried on that custodianship through the various generations. You see that in the rather touching vignette of when Baldwin and Tancred, later on in the First Crusade, when Baldwin and Tancred lead a very small party to Bethlehem as the Crusader army approaches Jerusalem, and they're met by the native Christian community, who had all the relics of the Nativity basically in hiding for centuries, and revealed it to them. It's interesting to me that there's no mention whatsoever, any commentary or participation by the native Christians in this, and so it does. I think that raises a considerable question mark about the authenticity of this, because even to this day, Catholicism is actually very rather rigorous when it comes to its relics, and one of the conditions is, how far back does this go? How far back has this thing been associated with what people claim it to be? To me, it's very curious that the Eastern Christian factor isn't there with this.
Yeah,
I never thought of it that way, Rand. That's interesting.
Most of them would have thought.
I haven't either.
Most of them would have thought it was in Constantinople. So, in that regard, apparently some of the Christians of Antioch come out and venerate the cross when it is carried in procession by the Crusaders. But I think we should also note that it wasn't just the discovery of the cross that was important. Peter Bartholomew also had a number of other visions and prophecies about forthcoming Crusader victory. So the cross, or excuse me, not the cross, the lance, in a sense, validated Peter Bartholomew's visions, and then his visions and prophecies gives you the morale boost. So Christ's presence is there, and it affirms Peter Bartholomew's visions, and his visions say we're going to win. Therefore, it boosts the morale even more than just here's a holy relic, because relics, there were lots of relics around, and this is a great one, but the visions associated with the relic further boosted the morale.
Yeah. All right, good points, everybody. So the next big thing that's going to happen here is that the Crusaders are going to actually plan a breakout attack from Antioch, and it's about a month or so after they've been holed up in Antioch, and Bohemond actually is going to organize this attack, this sally from the city. And it's very well organized. It's one of the most interesting aspects of the First Crusade, I think. This is going to happen on June 28th. At this point, the Crusaders have very few horses. The number I got from Thomas Madden was 200 horses at this point. So, compare that to all the horses that Kerbogha has. He's got, an enormous army of cavalry. Most of the army is going to have to fight on foot for the Crusaders. There's just not going to be very many horses available. So I want to get sort of an overview of what happens with this battle. And Dr. Hamlin, I would love to hear your description of that. Do you want to kind of describe what happens here?
Sure. The Crusaders are in a strategic situation where they basically have no choice but to march out of the city and fight. They're essentially out of food. They could maybe last a few more weeks, and then that's it. There is no relief army available to them. So if they stay and fight, they have to endure a long siege. They can't endure a long siege because they have no food and no way to get food. There's no relief coming. And so their only option is to fight. The question then becomes how to do that most effectively. And what they do is they come out of the bridge gate, which is the major bridge over the river Orontes, which flows by Antioch there. They cross over that, and everybody is essentially on foot. There's a couple hundred knights, and their function is not going to be to do this traditional knightly charge. It's going to be to support, ride back and forth, take care of some, ancillary issues, maybe shore up a weak point in the line. What that means, though, is all of the knights are fighting as infantry, basically, which greatly strengthens the quality and heavy infantry quality of the Crusader army. So being on foot can be, in a sense, a benefit to the Crusaders in this battle, because the Turks are not used to a Western Crusader army. They fought Byzantine armies, but they fight differently than did the Crusaders. Kilij Arslan of Rome had fought the Crusaders, but he wasn't there to advise the army. This is a new army. They've never fought this type of battle before. And so being all on foot meant that they could create a solid, thick, disciplined shield wall. Their experience meant they could be disciplined. They would know that the Turks are going to do a, charge up, shoot some arrows and run away. They're used to that now. That's not going to upset them or make them try to chase the Turks or anything like that. So basically, the goal is to get the entire army out of the city, because if they attack with only half the army, they have to have a concentration of force with the maximum number of soldiers possible. They therefore line up in columns. They march out, and then the first column, using the Orontes River and the gatehouse as a base to hold their flank, their right flank, it turns from a column to a line and then starts marching, and as marching forward, and then the next column comes out and it goes up further past the length of the first column, turns into line, and then joins them. And they essentially are able to get, they're divided into four major formations, and then within those formations, there's several minor ones. They organize along ethnic organization, that is, all the French are together and the Normans are together, or the southern Italian Normans. They also organize according to feudal organization, that is, everybody follows with their lord and so forth. They march out and they try to form a giant line here. Now there's some problems with that, in that there's apparently Turks down at the St. George Gate, which is further south from the bridge gate, and they come and try to attack them in the rear, but there's not numerous enough to harm the Crusaders. We need to note a couple things about the Turks during this battle. Number one, everybody surrounding the city is on foot. That is to say, you don't ride your horse around when you're trying to besiege a city. You've got to do this on foot. Now, they may have had some horses there, but most of their horses were not by Antioch. The reason for this is pasture. They had taken them up several miles to the north to some big plains, which is much better watered, and they were watering and feeding their horses up there. An army the size of Kerbogha's might have had 20,000 horses. So this is a huge number. and they simply can't have them all right by the city. So they are fighting Turks on foot, and most Turks don't fight on foot. I mean, that's just not their natural military operation. So when they're forced to fight the Crusaders on foot, it puts the Turks at a disadvantage. Now, some of the Turks had some horses, but most of them were further north. Some of these seem to try to kind of circle around and do their traditional outflanking and circling movements, but the Crusaders are able to hold the line with this heavy infantry shield wall, and the Turks are essentially unable to break that formation. The goal of the archery harassment of mountain archers is break up the formation, then you can move in. And the infantry do a spectacular job just holding their form, and then they start marching forward. Well, more of the Turks that are surrounding the city start coming there, but we need to remember a bunch of the Turks are up in the citadel and around the mountain. A bunch of the Turks are surrounding the city, but probably half the army is up with the horses, and they're probably rotating troops around. That is, each regiment will serve some time at the fortress and then go back and so forth. So Kerbogha is up in the north. He's several miles away from the battle. When he hears about the battle, he starts to mobilize his cavalry, and he's faced with essentially a dilemma. Do I let all the Turks, all the Crusaders out of the city, or do I wait, or do I attack them immediately and win a victory over a small portion of the army, but the rest will run in and hide in the citadel? And so his hope is that if I let them all out, I can win a decisive victory, and the battle's over, and I don't have to continue this siege. Because remember, Kerbogha is facing the same type of logistical problems that the Crusaders face, and the pasture watering problem for his 20,000 horses or whatever he had. He decides to wait and let the Crusaders all come out. Partly, I think that is simply because he had no choice, because his army was several miles away, and it probably would have taken an hour for the Crusaders to come out and make their formations, and it would have taken at least that long for Kerbogha to reach the Crusaders. So what the Crusaders do is they start moving their shield wall forward, and the Turks that will attack them, some on horseback, many on foot, don't attack them forming a shield wall, but forming a skirmishing line and a harassing line. And the Crusaders are simply able to move forward. And eventually these Turks start to break. And about the time the Turkish infantry start to break, Kerbogha's first group comes in, first group of cavalry from the north come in, and they move in and they attack the Crusaders, but again, don't come, one-on-one, face-to-face with them. It's a skirmishing battle. And as the infantry all start to flee, the cavalry start to flee. And when the rest of Kerbogha's army comes on the scene, probably half his army didn't even get in the fight. All these fleeing troops start moving through his main body, and it completely breaks up their formations. And at that moment, all of the dubious vassals decide to cut and run. They have no reason to stay and fight for Kerbogha. They hope he loses. They can preserve then their own domains in Damascus or wherever it might be. And so what you see is an initial flight of the first formations. The second formation gets in there and starts getting broken up. And as the army is starting to break up and panic, all of his allies flee. Now some of them stayed, but the ones that are dubious allies, they just take off. And what that does is essentially his army disintegrates before his eyes, and the Crusaders just keep marching, and the Turks start to flee, and the Crusaders are able to march all the way a couple miles and get to the camp and sack the Turkish camp. And when that occurs, the emir in the citadel realizes that he has no hope now, and he immediately surrenders, essentially to save his soldiers' lives and treasure, whatever personal belongings they have. And there's some dispute about who gets the citadel, but it ends up in Bohemond's hands, and it's essentially a decisive victory. And it is that because the Crusaders were able to concentrate all their forces. The Turks were on foot that were besieging the city. The breakup of the army, of the initial Turkish battalions, the flight of the dubious allies, and then the kind of the breakup of Kerbogha's main force by all of these fleeing soldiers breaking into his force and disrupting his force, where he basically loses command, and then everybody panics and runs. So that's how I understand what happened in the battle, and it's a decisive victory for the Crusaders, but it is not, it's decisive not because they destroy his whole army, but because his alliance breaks up and he withdraws. Anyway, that's how I understand the situation.
I would argue from just a purely strategic standpoint, the victory at Antioch is perhaps the decisive victory of the First Crusade. It's the one that really makes it possible for them to even Jerusalem.
Yes, strategically, that's
it really does.
Right. Yeah,
yeah, it really does.
It's a little. It's not decisive in the sense of completely destroying the enemy army.
No,
tactically, but strategically, yes, it is their supreme victory. Yeah. Absolutely.
And I mean, Kerbogha practically disappears from the record after this. He basically returns to Mosul in humiliation after this, and one can only imagine that his dreams of expanding his power base out into the Levant have just been very abruptly crushed, and in no small part to the emirs who sold him out. The action at Antioch it really is just incredible, and I think even tactically it demonstrates just how professional the crusading army has become at this point. I also think it's interesting that this is the first engagement, and actually the last, that Bohemond was officially given total command of the army by the fellow Crusader leaders. Unlike at Dorylaeum, where he was, where he was in command of the vanguard almost by happenstance. Here, that all the chronicles made a very big deal that, just before they went out to face Kerbogha, all the Crusader leaders gave Bohemond ultimate command over the army, and John France does a really good job in Victory in the East, talking about how, the hallmark of Bohemond's disposition was aggression. He never stood on the defensive, and he never allowed the enemy to settle his formation. And you really see that at Antioch at the sally with Kerbogha. Sallies are in the context of a siege, a sally is an incredibly risky gamble. In fact, it's probably the riskiest thing a defending force could ever do, because you're essentially foregoing your very strong defensive position you're coming outside the walls, outside the protection of the walls to meet your besiegers out in the field, and you could really tell Bohemond's ultimate objective was to close with the Turkish forces as fast as possible and hit them hard and hit them first.
And in part that's because
pushing them back.
In part that's because the Turks had more archers than the Crusaders, so any type of static warfare is to the disadvantage of the Crusaders.
Essentially they had to come in close and grab them by the belt buckle before they could do anything. It really was just I think even tactically it highlighted Bohemond and really the rest of the Crusaders too, because it wasn't just a one-man affair. The real tactical superiority of this crusading force at this juncture, and that they understood who they were up against. They knew how to fight them, and they had the discipline and the command and control to be able to see it through, even in incredibly risky maneuvers like sallying out from Antioch.
Yeah. One other thing I forgot to mention is that Adhemar carries the lance. I think it actually is Raymond, the chronicler, that carries the lance as a banner, and the morale then of the army. The Crusaders had a big advantage in that as well, in that many of the Crusader soldiers really thought that God was on their side and they were going to win this victory by divine intervention. And so that type of morale boost also contributed, I think, to their victory.
Yeah, good points there from both you guys. The thing that I think is so interesting about this point in about the Battle of Antioch is, yeah, that point of the bridge gate was such a good place to actually launch this attack, because they had the river Orontes is going to cover one of their flanks and reduce the ability of the Turks to fully engage with them. And on top of that, it's kind of like, I guess the term would maybe be choke point, right, Rand? Like, this is kind of a point where the army, Kerbogha's army is kind of a little bit unwieldy in a certain respect. I mean, it's very large. It's dispersed all around Antioch.
Yeah,
and
it's
so
extremely unwieldy.
Yeah, and they only have to defeat necessarily that immediate portion of the army that they're facing as they sally forth from the bridge gate. And once they're kind of able to make that group retreat, and once that portion of the army sort of breaks and flees, that right there is the thing that starts the ball rolling down the hill and gets it gets Kerbogha's unloyal allies to take off, and
it gives them the excuse they need to do what they wanted to do anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah. It really was for the Crusaders. It was a victory of a couple of tactical concepts. One was the effective concentration of mass. The mass his combat power at the precise points where it was needed. Even despite facing a much larger force, and it was a failure to concentrate mass on Kerbogha's part. He had this very large, very unwieldy army that was kind of spread out all over the place. And they were unable to react when the Crusaders found that soft spot, and pushed hard.
And in a sense, it was a surprise attack, even though it took them an hour or so to organize. It took less time than it took Kerbogha to concentrate his force to oppose them. So the Crusaders had a surprise in a sense, but then also probably at the actual point of battle had a numerical superiority, even though in the large context they had numerical inferiority. Through concentration of force, they gained at the crucial time and place numerical superiority.
Yeah, good points, everybody.
One other thing to note, as they come out the gate, there's about a 2-mile plain, and then there's some rough, hilly country off to the west, which would also serve as a block to Crusader or Turkish cavalry tactics. So basically, they could fill up the plain with their infantry in this huge shield wall, and then just do a constant, steady advance, and just keep push as hard as they could go, and keep their formation against any Turks that came up to them. And the Turks kind of came in piecemeal. So you beat one little group, they flee, another group comes, they flee, and it got that snowball rolling of panic, and I think that helped too.
Yeah, and one thing I've also always thought is, we get this idea that Kerbogha, it's like he had this option of, okay, well, do I, fully engage these guys now, or do I let them all come out of the city? And I think sort of the common wisdom is, well, that was kind of stupid. You should have really hit them a lot harder than you did, rather than kind of allowing them to fully deploy. But I mean, I've always been able to see the logic behind his decision there. I mean, he doesn't want to spend, months and months and months outside of Antioch. He doesn't want to have to damage Antioch either necessarily. I mean, it's very hard to damage anyway. I can kind of see why he might have thought, okay, well, I'll just I'll let these guys come out and then I'll just annihilate them. I mean, I think his big error was he didn't realize that he was dealing with such a capable fighting force. I think maybe what he was hoping would happen is, okay, well, this is a small group that's that's been heavily, that's really endured a lot of attrition already. They aren't they're weary. They're pent up in this city. They're starving and stuff. Surely we just get these guys out here and I could just smash them. But I don't think he realized that he was dealing with such an effective fighting force. So
no, I would say that's very correct. I think that the fact that the fact that Kerbogha very clearly underestimated who he was facing is pretty apparent. I know there's some apocryphal vignettes of that portray him playing chess with one of his subordinate commanders. When the Crusaders began sallying out. And he very much is portrayed as sort of having this kind of very flippant attitude towards, oh yes, well that's fine, we'll deal with it in due time, kind of thing. And then all of a sudden it's like, no, sir, they're here, like, they're at the outskirts of your camp, like right now, kind of thing. So and whether or not whether or not the chess playing story is true or not, I think it does illustrate that he did very much underestimate them to his ultimate defeat.
It's not just underestimation, although that's crucial. It's also that he didn't know how they would fight. He'd never fought an army like this before, and so his expectations were that it would be a battle more like against Byzantines, in which Turkish tactics, what they do, they kind of adapted their tactics to fight that type of combat. And here there's this brand new thing that he didn't know how tactically to get to the Crusader weaknesses. So it's both, and in a sense that's underestimating the enemy, but it's also just not knowing the enemy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so that's what happens with the Battle of Antioch. The Crusaders win. Kerbogha is totally defeated, and his army dissipates. And this is going to leave the Crusaders in control of Antioch, and it's going to set them up with the ability to control a fairly large chunk of northern Syria with the establishment of the Principality of Antioch, which is going to happen over the next few years. So, yeah, as you were saying earlier, Rand, this is a major victory for the First Crusade. This is one more step on the road toward Jerusalem. So, yeah, this has been a really interesting discussion. I'm going to jump over to the chat here and see if anybody has any questions before we go for tonight. If anybody's listening and you have any questions, go ahead and ask us in the chat. The panel will now take your questions. But does anybody have any further comments about this point in the Crusade? I mean, Dr. Hamblin, where are the Crusaders now? Like, what issues are they facing? What's the next step?
Well, what we're going to see is, first of all, they've got to kind of resupply their army and rest. Just they've been through so much that everybody's exhausted. There's insufficient food. They're running low on money, all that type of stuff. So they need to stay for a while. A big problem is going to be the death of Adhemar on August 1st, just a few days after the battle, is going to lead to a crisis of leadership within the Crusade. And I assume we'll talk about that next time. But it's the fissures within the crusading movement have been held together by common necessity up through this point. Now, when the threat is at least mitigated at Antioch, all of these kind of rivalries, jealousies, fissures are going to come to the fore, and they're going to have some real squabbling among the princes. And then they've got to kind of resolve all that in order to now make the last leg of their journey, which is the march down to Jerusalem.
Yeah, absolutely. So one guy asked the question, if Bohemond had not been there, would the Battle of Antioch have failed? What do you think, guys? I think that's probably. I would say that's a pretty big what if, but it seems kind of reasonable to say that he was pretty essential to what happened.
Bohemond really was the linchpin of the siege of Antioch. I mean, he was he was by far the MVP of the siege of Antioch. I think there's always the what if factor, but I would argue that it probably would have ended very differently had he not been there.
No disagreements here, and I want to backtrack a little bit. And the strategic planning. What knowledge did Bohemond have of the composition of Kerbogha's army and the coalition, and how much did that play into his planning? I mean, did he know that these men would did any knowledge that they would conceivably desert? Play any role in the strategic planning for the breakout or for the.
We know that they sent some ambassadors, and so they probably got to look at the camp and look at the situation in general terms. I think they certainly heard rumors from scouts and local people, and maybe like a couple Armenian spies who brought in some cows to sell the Turks and got some information that way. But I don't think he had a clear grip on the details. Most medieval armies couldn't get that type of information. A lot of rumor and a lot of false rumor too. Just one quick comment on Bohemond. I think he was certainly decisive in the battle. I suspect if he hadn't been there, they might not have gone out at all, and they may have probably just ended up dying, surrendering from starvation. So there's no way to know, but that would be my guess, is that Bohemond's aggressiveness kind of pushed forward the rest. Maybe Godfrey could have taken that role if Bohemond hadn't been there. So it's possible they could still have won, but it would be iffy.
There's an interesting question here. Did Crusaders use any siege weapons during the First Crusade? This is coming to us from Mr. Uther Lightbringer. Few. I know some of the sources mention both at Nicaea and at Antioch. They mentioned some. However, from what I recall, they weren't very effective. In fact, I think they had. I think especially like more kind of like earlier in the Crusade, a lot of the siege engines that they tried to make were pretty shoddily made and whatnot. But I think there were some siege weapons that were that the parts were brought with the Anglo-Byzantine fleet that sailed into I believe it was St. George, or not St. George, the
St. Simeon.
St. Simon, St. Simeon. I think there were some components of siege engines that were brought in, if I recall, but I can't remember like what impact they had.
Well, during the siege of Antioch, they weren't really doing that, right?
No.
Yeah, that would be late. At Nicaea, we've got siege equipment, and in Jerusalem we do, but here that doesn't really play a part in where we.
No,
I think they did have siege engines of sorts, but they were not powerful enough to project the stone with enough size and speed and distance to damage walls as powerful as Antioch's. So they didn't even try. At Jerusalem, they mainly used siege towers. They did have some stone projectile machines. These were not trebuchets like you see in the movies. Those come in the, around Saladin's time. So they were much smaller and had a a lower range and a lower velocity and a lower weight of projectile that they could throw. They also did some undermining. Apparently at Nicaea, they had they called them sometimes a tortoise or a cat, or there's different names they use. But it's a shed of sorts that they build and cover with wood and maybe some skins and keep it wet so that it doesn't get on fire. They push it up against the wall and they try to tear the walls down. So they were able to bring down a tower at Nicaea through both undermining and some projectile work.
Yeah.
But it was not very numerous and not very effective for the most part.
Yeah.
The tower at Jerusalem was the most effective siege engine that they used.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go. You guys want to do one more question? Somebody asked, what happened to the Holy Lance after?
That's the one I was. That's the one I was
Okay,
going to get.
What happened to the Holy Lance after all this? That is interesting.
It really, I don't think anyone really knows. I do know the relic of the Holy Lance, or at least the lance head, that is currently in the Imperial Museum in Vienna. I believe, from what I understand, that is the Holy Lance that was in Constantinople.
Okay.
So the Holy Lance that was found at Antioch in the First Crusade, I don't think there's any real record of what happened to that at all, and it most likely doesn't exist anymore today, or at least if it does, no one knows where it is. I know I have some people mentioning the Holy Spear, the Spear of Destiny, the Lance of Longinus. Actually, the Spear of Destiny and the Lance of Longinus are two different things. And this is me as a Roman Catholic is going to step in here. The Lance of Longinus is the shaft of the spear, and that is contained in one of the 4 central altar pillars in St. Peter's in Rome. There's a huge statue of St. Longinus behind it, and the shaft is enshrined somewhere within that pillar. I think down near the base, and they only bring it out once a year. There's 4 main relics around the 4.
Are you speaking of the baldacchino, Rand?
Yes. No, not the baldacchino. No, the 4 stone pillars that are around the baldacchino.
Okay.
And it's the Veil of Veronica, the shaft of Longinus, a piece of the cross of St. Andrew, and honestly, I can't remember what the 4th one was. Yeah. So the Lance of Longinus and the Spear of Destiny are two different things. The Spear of Destiny is the spearhead that is currently in the Imperial Museum in Vienna. And it's been associated with the Holy Roman Emperors of Germany, at least ever since the 4th Crusade and the sack of Constantinople, from whence it was taken. There's a lot of kind of mythological stories that surround it. Some say, it goes all the way back to the time of Charlemagne, which is why the Holy Roman Emperors always kind of had a claim on it. Others say it goes back to early Spain. So there's all sorts of almost kind of Arthurian-esque sort of Holy Grail-ish kind of legends surrounding it. But as of right now, I mean, they've done. Modern researchers have done research on it, and it's very difficult to determine its actual age because it's been embellished throughout the centuries and had things added onto it. So it's really, I guess this is a long way of saying we don't really know, and officially the church doesn't really know, and they very meekly admit as much today.
I don't think anybody knows what happened to the lance that they found in Antioch. My suspicion is that it was taken to Jerusalem and then placed in a reliquary and probably kept there somewhere, but it was very quickly superseded by the True Cross, which became the the military relic, and so the lance kind of fades away. Relic. And probably it got stolen in some plundering thing that happened to Jerusalem, a couple times during the Crusades. So I know of no source that describes any of that type of stuff. And part of the problem was it was never universally accepted. It was basically, the Provençals who were really into that lens. So
it really does just sort of disappear from the record after Antioch.
I had to unmute myself there. Yeah. Okay. So some really good information there, guys. I think we've probably gone long enough. Does anybody else have anything they want to add to this particular podcast?
I'm good.
Okay, great. Yeah, this has been a really good discussion. I really enjoyed it, guys. Thanks so much for everybody's contribution. So I'm just going to say thanks to each of you. Scott, thanks for being here.
Sure. Always glad to, as I always say, glad to be here, Stephen.
Absolutely. And just since we're talking about the First Crusade, FYI to everybody, Scott has written a really good historical novel called To Shine with Honor. And it's actually going to be a 3-part series set during the First Crusade era. So it's worth checking out if you find the First Crusade entertaining.
Second volume is in progress now.
Absolutely. And I will link to that in the information box in this podcast. And Rand, I want to thank you for being here. Thanks so much.
As always, glad to be here.
Excellent. And Dr. Hamlin, we've really enjoyed getting to have you on for so many podcasts. Thanks so much for being a part of this and contributing your knowledge.
Happy to participate. Thanks.
Excellent. Dr. Hamlin's got a really good website for anybody who's interested. It's called crusadingwarfare.net. So, Dr. Hamlin, what have you been doing with your website and YouTube channel lately?
Well, I'm essentially working through the First Crusade, trying to create a series of maps of the military history of the Crusades with as much detail as possible. And then from those maps, I kind of display them on the computer in Keynote and do videos where I describe what's going on and kind of narrate the maps. And then I do the next batch and do another video. So every, maybe twice a week, I do some videos. I've got one that's all ready to go. I'll probably do it today or tomorrow. So.
Yeah, it's some really good stuff. Crusadingwarfare.net, a lot of really good information about the military history of the Crusades. And also, of course, there's that YouTube channel, which has the same name, Crusading Warfare. So, I've got that linked in the information box for this podcast. So you can find that down below if you're interested. And so thanks so much to everybody who's been a part of this, who's been listening. Thanks for the questions, everybody. Sorry we couldn't get to more questions. At some point, we'll do another podcast that will just be taking questions. So, everybody who's got any questions they have, they will get answered at some point. This is Real Crusades History. You can find us at realcrusadeshistory.com. I also want to just remind everybody, if you like what we do, you can go to our Patreon and support us. And we have a new thing going where if you pledge $5 a month or more to our Patreon, you will get access to exclusive content on our Patreon feed. So that's some good stuff. Thanks everybody for being here, and we will be back next Tuesday, right, guys?
Right.
Yep.
All right, next Tuesday we're gonna get into the advance on Jerusalem and hopefully talk a little bit about the siege, the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. We might get all the way to the end of the siege of Jerusalem. We'll see about that. But yeah, you'll have to wait till next Tuesday to find out what happens after the victorious encounter with Kerbogha at Antioch. So, all right, thanks so much, everybody. We will see you next Tuesday, same time, 7 p.m. U.S. Central Time. Okay.